This video details the cooperation and conflict of First Nations people with European settlers and explorers in New France. On the Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec, young Micmac men fished south of the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. It was 1534. Their ancestors, part of the Algonquin Aboriginal nations, had lived in this area for at least 11,000 years. The land and rivers provided everything they needed. In turn, they cared for the land and water. The Micmac took no more than they needed from the earth. The fishermen looked up to see two large ships on the water. French vessels had long fished the Atlantic waters off the Canadian shores. But these two tall ships were something new. Like floating islands, the tall ships drifted in from the sea. Their white sails floated like clouds above them. The Micmac fishermen saw light-skinned humans with beards on the ships' decks. Where'd they come from, and why were they here? The tall ships Cartier sailed 4,000 kilometers across the Atlantic Ocean were called carracks. Carracks served as warships or cargo ships. The sturdy vessels usually had 3 masts. They could withstand the roughness of stormy weather and high seas encountered on ocean voyages. In turn, the French seamen aboard the tall ships looked towards shore. On April 20th, Jacques Cartier and his 61-man crew had set sail from Saint-Malo on the northern coast of France. The ships had crossed the Atlantic Ocean with only the power of wind. Cartier was determined to find the riches he had been told awaited him. He had sailed to North America to find a waterway through the continent. Such a waterway would be a shortcut to China. Cartier's crew were not the first Europeans to sail to North America. Explorers from both Spain and Great Britain had arrived decades earlier. They had explored the land south and west of the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. The appearance, language, and behavior of the visitors were strange to the Micmac. But the Micmac and the Iroquois, the other First Nation Cartier encountered, were generous and welcoming. They gave the French valuable gifts such as beaver pelts and salted cod. In return, Cartier's crew offered trinkets, knives, and glass beads. After exploring Labrador and Newfoundland, Cartier and his crew briefly entered the St. Lawrence River. Cartier did not find a waterway through North America to China, but he did find fertile green lands for growing crops and abundant cod in the river for fishing. In the crew's travels, First Nations communities treated the French generously and kindly, but Cartier did not return the favor. Instead, he took 2 sons of Iroquois chief Donnacona hostage. Then Cartier, his crew, and the hostages returned to France. In 1535, Cartier returned to North America. This time, Cartier took 3 ships and a crew of approximately 110 men. The 2 Iroquoian hostages he had taken a year before were with him. The hostages guided Cartier westward on the St. Lawrence River. He was still looking for a water route to China. The cold weather took the lives of some of the crew. 25 of them died from bitter winter weather conditions and a disease called scurvy. The survivors sailed for France in the spring of 1536. With them they took 10 Iroquois as hostages. Cartier did not return to North America for 5 years. In 1541, Cartier set sail for North America in the hope of finding gold. This time he brought European settlers with him, but his actions and treatment of First Nations on his previous 2 trips had made these communities wary. Instead of a warm welcome, Cartier encountered hostility. Cartier built a fort along the Rivière du Cap Rouge called Charlesbourg Royal. That winter, the Iroquois attacked the French in retaliation for their ill treatment. Over the winter months, 35 settlers lost their lives. The French abandoned the fort in June 1542. In France, beaver pelts continued to gain in popularity. They were used to make hats and other goods. By the early 1600s, French explorers traveled once again to North America. They tried bartering with the First Nations for beaver fur. In return, the French offered steel axes, guns, needles, and copper kettles. These goods changed the Aboriginal way of life. Unwittingly, French traders also exposed First Nations to European diseases. Illnesses that were mild for Europeans devastated Aboriginal populations. Early attempts to establish a permanent French colony had failed. In 1604, King Henry IV of France again tried to establish a colony in North America. If successful, France would become a power in the Western Hemisphere. The king hired skilled mapmaker and seaman Samuel de Champlain to explore North America for a place to colonize. Champlain thoroughly explored around modern-day Nova Scotia. In 1608, the explorers established a fishing and fur trading colony in Quebec. It would become Quebec City. The colonists adopted some of the survival skills of their Aboriginal neighbors. Fewer colonists died from bitter winters. Champlain actively sought alliances with the Micmac and other Algonquin nations. These communities helped the colonists hunt. They also provided protection from hostile Aboriginal communities such as the Iroquois. First Nations have been making alliances for centuries. Communities tended to ally with nations that shared the same or similar languages. They often shared the same or adjacent hunting grounds. But alliances made friends of some First Nations and enemies of others. When Quebec allied with the Algonquin, they made enemies of the Algonquins' historical enemies, the Iroquois. These hostilities would continue until the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763. In that conflict, the Iroquois sided with France's European enemy, Great Britain. As New France grew, the territory extended over a large portion of the continent. Alliances with Aboriginal people became more imperative. After Champlain established Quebec in 1608, French settlers flocked to the continent. Another colony was established on the St. Lawrence River, and a third became modern-day Montreal. By 1642, New France was growing. But the growing colonies posed problems for both the French and their First Nations neighbors. French survival relied on friendly trade relationships with the Aboriginal peoples. The Huron-Wendat provided new French settlers with corn, squash, and tobacco. They also provided the beaver fur that made French traders wealthy in Europe. In return, the Huron-Wendat and other First Nations received goods from Europe, but they also continued to fall ill from European diseases. The French had been in North America for less than 100 years. In that time, measles, smallpox, and influenza had killed approximately half of the Aboriginal people in New France. Today, historians still study the effect of disease on First Nations communities in New France. First Nations people did not have immunity from European diseases. Over time, contact with European diseases decimated the Aboriginal population. Some historians claim they took up to 90% of native lives. Long before the French arrived, beavers and other mammals had been important food sources for First Nations. At first, there was enough beavers to feed First Nations and to satisfy the French desire for fur. But French traders demanded more and more pelts to trade in France. The fur trade changed how First Nations hunted. Communities often received guns in trade for fur. Hunters could kill many more beavers with guns than with bows and arrows. More beaver fur brought more goods to the community. Soon, beavers and other mammals became scarce. The booming fur trade required new French colonists to maintain good trade relationships with their Aboriginal neighbors. But the trade also created struggles for the French and First Nations alike. By 1650, there were only 700 colonists in New France. Millions of Aboriginal people had lost their lives to European diseases. The First Nations had a long history of rich spiritual beliefs, just as the French settlers did. These beliefs collided in New France. Aboriginal beliefs were closely tied to the natural world. Sacred medicines, including cedar, sage, and tobacco. First Nations used these medicines to thank the Creator, the plants, and the animals for their natural gifts. Individuals might keep these medicines with them in a small pouch. They might fast or cleanse their body and spirit in a sweat lodge. Communities would mark special occasions with celebrations. They would come together to name a new child or to dance, drum, and sing. Jesuit priests traveled to New France to spread Roman Catholicism. There, they encountered Aboriginal spiritual practices. These practices looked very different from those of the French Catholics. Many missionaries did not respect Aboriginal spiritual beliefs. Instead, they tried to convert First Nations people to Catholicism. During the first half of the 1600s, Jesuit missionaries were trying to go widespread in New France. Their initial approach was to simply teach Aboriginal people about Catholicism, but Jesuit missionaries converted few Aboriginal people this way. Soon, they took a new approach. Converting Aboriginal people became a matter of bribery. Missionaries promised First Nations people they could become French citizens if they converted. They allowed Aboriginal people to recite Catholic prayers in their own languages. They traded weapons for conversion. The Jesuits even tried to find ways to explain Catholicism to make it fit with some of the native views and practices. In the end, Aboriginal people resisted the change. Their spiritual beliefs were too different from Catholicism to make conversion popular. When Cartier set foot in North America in 1534, Aboriginal people far outnumbered European explorers. Aboriginal peoples numbered in the millions. European settlers numbered in the dozens in many areas. But by the 1700s, those numbers had flipped. British colonists numbered approximately 1.2 million people. Together, Spanish and French colonists numbered fewer than 100,000. By this time, First Nations had rapidly declined. Some communities had been uprooted and pushed inland from their homelands and hunting grounds. The European influx had changed Aboriginal life permanently. Hunting grounds had been depleted by the fur trade. Millions of First Nations people had succumbed to European diseases. France, Spain, and Great Britain all had colonies along the east coast of North America. They all wanted to expand their territory. Aboriginal peoples fought in European wars alongside their European allies. By the late 1700s, these conflicts brought an end to New France, but the French had forever changed the Aboriginal way of life.